coming up on Garden Talk.
You don't have to go buy calcium at the store. You can make your own calcium with eggshells and vinegar. I love vermicompost. Using worm compost is one of the best natural ways to feed your plants. You don't need guanos or cow manure or any of those other things. So the first thing you need to gauge is how much food waste are you producing? And then how much do you need to augment on top of that? And in general, the worms aren't going to escape because they don't like light. To get the full benefits out of cover crops, you need to chop and drop. In general, right, you should never have naked soil. After a while, if you have a good amount of soil and you have a good process going, you don't actually have to go buy soil either.
What's up, everybody? For you that don't know me, my name is Chris, aka Mr. Grow It, and you're tuned into the Garden Talk podcast. This is episode number 38. In this episode, I interview Jotaherb. He has been gardening for 35 years, and he has extensive knowledge when it comes to regenerative farming or gardening. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. He'll talk about what regenerative gardening is, its benefits, and several different practices that you can implement in your garden. Thanks to all of you who support this podcast through Patreon. If you'd like to support, you can do so by going to patreon.com/MrGrowIt. Before we get into it, I want to acknowledge that one of my goals for this podcast is to bring zero cost for information about gardening, all plants, to the general public. That being said, I'd like to thank the sponsors of this podcast who help make that goal possible. AC Infinity is a sponsor of the podcast. Coupon code MrGrowIt will get you a discount on their products. I've been using their Cloudline T6 and T4 inline fans for several years now, and I absolutely love the automation built into them. On the inline fans controller, you can have set points for high and low temperature, as well as high and low humidity. This greatly helps control my indoor garden environment, so the temperature and humidity stays in the ideal ranges. I will leave a link to AC Infinity down in the description section below, and don't forget to use coupon code MrGrowIt for a discount on their products. Thanks to Dutch Pro for sponsoring this podcast. Dutch Pro products are now available in several countries across the world. For those of you that don't know, Dutch Pro is a plant fertilizer company that has base nutrients, additives, and pH regulators. They have different formulas of base nutrients for if you're in soil or if you're in hydro or cocoa. They also formulate their base nutrients for if you're using hard water or if you're using RO or soft water. I will leave a link to Dutch Pro's Amazon store down in the description section below, and you can use coupon code MrGrowIt10DP for a discount on their products. Big shout out to Spider Farmer for sponsoring this podcast. Spider Farmer is well known to produce high quality LED grow lights at a price lower than nearly all other companies. They have board style LED grow lights as well as bar style LED grow lights. I've used their SF1000, SF2000, and SF4000 LED grow lights in the past, and I got some excellent results with them. They also have grow tents, inline fans, and carbon filters. I will leave a link to Spider Farmer down in the description section below, and you can use discount code MrGrowIt5 during checkout for a discount on their products. And we are back. Welcome to the Garden Talk podcast. Today I am joined with Jotaherb. How are you today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks so much for having me. Really, really excited to have this conversation with you today.
I'm excited to have you on. You have extensive knowledge when it comes to regenerative gardening or regenerative farming, whatever you want to call it, KNF. You do a lot of these practices within your garden. I know you through Instagram. I also seen that you've been on other podcasts and shows and just spilling a bunch of good knowledge. So super excited to have you on today. This is going to be pretty much like I would say an introduction to regenerative gardening. A lot of my audience, I would say a majority probably are home growers, and that they are probably more on the bottled nutrient side of things. There's quite a few organic gardeners as well that are part of it. But I know there's a lot of people that are looking to transition over to the organic side, looking to start regenerative gardening. So I thought this would be a good episode to kind of be an introduction to it. And then hopefully viewers will be able to get an understanding of it, at least a basic understanding of what it is, and hopefully learn some practices that they can implement in their garden,
Yep. And I'm going to hopefully provide some fantastic names as well for people to follow up on, because there's just so much great work going on all over the globe, really. in regenerative farming practices. So it's fantastic. I personally got into growing things because I grew up in a food business. And I was always around fresh foods, fresh herbs and ingredients that my family used in the cooking. My grandfather was a butcher, so he also used to go get the full sides of beef. And my dad ran restaurants and used to pick out all the vegetables and fruits and things by hand. And we always had gardens going as well, so that we had fresh stuff to cook with, lots of rosemaries and spices and garlic and onions and things like that. My parents were always growing some type of an ingredient. And as I got older and was continuing to work in the food business, we always had herbs available at the restaurants. There was usually something growing out back that we would go and pick at the beginning of the day, or excuse me, or we were getting lots of fresh herbs in, and I always would tend to gravitate towards helping care for those plants and helping bring the fresh stuff in and helping pick out the right types of vegetables and things to consume. So that was my background, and so I have a real appreciation for high quality food. And so that's really where I got started. And I've always been really interested in just gardening and having those ingredients at hand year round. I put, basil and parsley and other things on my windowsill. I keep them under fluorescent lights, do different things to keep them going year round. As I was talking with you earlier, I've started playing around with microgreens too. I love microgreens. They're fantastic to taste and tremendously beneficial health-wise for you. So that's kind of where I got into it. And regenerative farming is really, really important. If you look at where our food comes from, and unfortunately we've gotten very disconnected as a society on where our food comes from, right? Most people's interaction with food is at the store, the grocery store. They have no idea where it came from. They don't know what the plant looks like it was picked off of. They may not even know that much about the animal that it came from either. And that disconnection has allowed a lot of practices that have been going on that have been harmful to the environment and very impactful to all sorts of different things, because our environment is connected, right? You can't, everything impacts everything else. The winds that blow in the Middle East pick up nitrogen and sand that blows across in the atmosphere and lands in Brazil, and is actually one of the ways that the rainforests are nutrified. So we are in a big, large, global connected system. But when you look closer to home and you look at our agricultural practices, unfortunately, over the last 150 years, and really the last 70 years primarily, commercial agriculture has followed practices that, while they were able to produce large amounts of food, that food did not have a lot of nutritive value to it. And all of those practices were extremely detrimental to the land that those foods and animals were being grown on. The farmer will grow on a bunch of land and use it until it's basically just dead, and then move on to another plot of land, and then move on to another plot of land, and they keep going and going and going, and the property becomes so depleted in natural biology and natural protections that it's not able to heal. And so regenerative farming is a whole bunch of different practices that revolve around trying to regenerate the area. But in general, what we're trying to do is leave the land better than when we got it. So as opposed to this almost strip mining approach that has caused us to lose 70% of the topsoil in the middle of the United States, that was responsible for the Dust Bowl, that's responsible for a lot of our flooding and runoff problems and pollution within our oceans and rivers today, is because of this destruction of the natural environment. You can farm in ways, though, that help actually regenerate the soils and help give back to the land and capture carbon and stop runoff. So there's less flooding because the water can flow down into these really, really healthy soils. So regenerative farming is, again, looking for ways to rebuild and make things better than when we left them. Organic is not the same as regenerative, and that's an important thing to remember. Organic means that all of the things that went into the making of that plant or animal were also certified organic. The seeds, the nutrients, the soils, the teas, whatever was applied to those plants had to be certified organic for them to be able to claim that this is a certified organic product. However, it's still in many cases following bad commercial practices which continue to destroy the land, like tilling. Tilling is one of the largest reasons why we have so many problems with our soil health today. And tilling's been around for a long, long time. If you go back even in U.S. history, some of our first presidents were promoters of tilling as a way to break up the land and make it a little bit easier for planting. And in many cases, the way that we used to till in those days with like just a big wedge dragged behind a horse was not as bad as what we do today, where we have these huge mechanized spinning discs that cut through the soil and destroy all of the natural fungal and biological life that's in that soil. All the worms, all of the arthropods, all of the fungal bodies, they get destroyed by tilling. So what are you left with? You're left with a highly bacterial soil that isn't as balanced for the plant. This causes increase in weed pressure, causes increases in pest pressures. It causes the soil to lose its ability to retain water, so we have to use more water to feed our plants. Because of the loss of the fungal and biological life in the soil, the plants aren't able to get as much access to the minerals and nutrients that are in that soil. So you have to add more stuff on, right? So even if you're using an organic product, but you till your soil, you're still not following regenerative practices. Regenerative practices are also great for animals as well. It's not just about plants. And in fact, the two together are a symbiotic combination that needs to be followed. One of the things that I think is really interesting for vegetarians to consider, okay, is that we still need cows, okay? The reason is that we don't have the herds of animals that used to exist in nature that would help with the basic biological processes that regenerated the soil. Their urine and defecation, they're churning up the land, but primarily in large herds that moved at very rapid paces and didn't stay in one place for a very long time because of predators. That type of movement, that type of activity is extremely beneficial for the land. And if you look at places in the US where they've actually allowed the wild buffaloes to come back, those grasslands have come back from what they once were to once they once were. And they were, in some cases, almost desertified because there wasn't the proper type of animals on that land. Just holding cattle in pens outside, though, is not enough. You have to rotate them much more often than our practices are today. And you also need to keep them in smaller pens to keep them clumped a little closer so that you get some of the benefits of them stomping the ground and kind of breaking down the cover crop and vegetation back into the soil, but also creating small pockets where water and bacteria can build, because their hoof prints will actually create these little puddles and microbiomes. And again, the urine, the feces, and all those things. And by keeping them rotating, you don't allow those animals to eat all the vegetation to the point where it's detrimental to that land, right? There's a couple of brothers, and I think the last name is Silva, but I can't remember the last name. But they're doing some stuff in the Oaxaca desert, which is in between Texas and Mexico. And it's basically one of the largest deserts in the world, the Oaxaca desert. And a large portion of their property is in that desert. And what they did was they changed the way they moved their cattle farmers. So they changed the way they moved their cattle and were able to actually rebuild the entire area of their land through proper cattle rotation only. By using proper cattle rotation, the natural species came back in. The birds and the animals carried the seeds, the plants spread, the biology moved with the water and the streams, and things started to come back from being a desert, actually turn back into a grassland naturally, just by changing the way they moved their cattle. But the use of cattle was necessary and important. So bringing cattle across a field before you do planting is a great way to help reinvigorate your field. Working with your neighbors, having your neighbors maybe feed on some of your crops so that their cows are also getting some of the benefits of your naturally grown vegetation, and they're also helping heal your land as well. So lots of great things. Some people to look at would be Dr. Elaine Ingham, who is the person who coined the soil food web, and really learn about the soil food web because it's a tremendous important part of regenerative farming. Ray Archuleta, Gabe Brown are also some fantastic people that you can go find out more from. And those are definitely some names I would recommend looking up and finding out more about. If you're interested in regenerative practices, I follow primarily a family of farming called Korean natural farming, which is a family, again, it's a Korean-based natural farming set of practices that utilizes natural inputs that you collect locally in your environment to feed your plants. So you collect plants to feed your plants. You use fermentation, and vinegars and sugars and other techniques for capturing indigenous microorganisms and building beneficial inputs for your own gardens. This is what I do all the time. I make all my own inputs. I don't buy anything at the grow store. If I go to a grow store, it's because I need a new fan or something along those lines. I don't go to the grow store for nutrients. I actually make all of my own nutrients. I make FPJs, which are fermented plant juice, FFJs, fermented fruit juices. You can make your own calcium. You don't have to go buy calcium at the store. You can make your own calcium with eggshells and vinegar or oyster shells and vinegar. 7 days with a breathable cap, and you have your own calcium for pennies. And it's really, really, really interesting way of creating nutrients and inputs for your plants. It's a wonderful way of farming, and all of the inputs are, in many cases, good for us as humans as well. They're good for animals. So there's approaches for chicken coops, for no-smell chicken coops, and no-smell pigsties with Korean natural farming, which are amazing, using lactic acid bacteria or lactobacillus and some other techniques. Just really, really cool stuff. So I hope that helped kind of give a little bit of a background and a primer on regenerative farming.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot, very interesting stuff there, a lot to unpack. So just a quick recap, I got a short list here. So regenerative gardening, some of these things you said, some of them you didn't say. Sun grown, rely on the sun to grow instead of kind of doing it indoors. Crop rotation, closed loop on-site plant nutrition, composting systems.
Yes.
So for watering, doing strategies through soil management, irrigation methods, using rainwater, right?
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
Talked about how it's beneficial to animals, healthy plants with companion planting, cover cropping, on-site food systems, pest management, not relying on chemical pesticides and herbicides. So a whole bunch of different things it can be enacted here.
Yep.
Now, narrowing it down to kind of the home grower, the person indoors that's doing their own gardening, maybe they have a 6 or 12 plant setup, or houseplants or whatever. Talk to us about closed loop operations. I know a lot of people, that is something that you can enact within the home gardening. So can you first tell us, what is closed loop operations and what are some things that people could do at home in order to implement that?
Yep. So I've actually mentioned a few of them already, but closed loop has to do with basically getting everything you need from within the confines of your own property. Right? So if you're running a farm, nothing comes in from the outside. You're building and utilizing all of the things within your property to feed and support and nurture and sustain your farm. It's the same thing for us as home cultivators, whether you're growing edible or medicinal plants, it really doesn't matter. Even your regular house plants as well, in many cases, can benefit from these systems. And as just a homeowner in general, right? Composting is a tremendous benefit. So if you're going to, if you have a little bit of land, building an outdoor compost or getting a compost box or something along those lines is a fantastic way to start. And it's a great way to reduce your food waste and your overall trash that you're sending to landfills and you're having picked up and all those things. You can take your coffee grounds, your used tea, your eggshells, the old vegetables, the ends, the green ends on the carrots that you don't want to eat, all the different pieces, all the things that you strip off of the vegetables when you peel your carrots, or the banana that just was overripe and you didn't want to eat it. All these things can go in your compost pile and can be recovered and renutrify your own for the benefit of your own garden. So composting is outdoors is one way to do it. Another thing you can do is, as I mentioned, vermicompost or worm farming. And that's great for indoors because you can have worms in a 5-gallon bucket. You can keep worms in a little box if you really want to. Obviously, they're only going to produce so much worm castings and they're only going to take up so much waste if you have only a small amount. But having a worm bin is a tremendous benefit, and actually one of my favorite things. I love vermicompost. Using worm compost is one of the best natural ways to feed your plants. You don't need guanos or cow manure or any of those other things. Really, vermicompost is mostly all you need. And it has the benefit of providing a lot of natural organisms and fungi along with it that help benefit the soil and build soil structure and all those things. I do put some worms in my pots occasionally, but I tend to keep them in my worm bin, actually. And I use red wrigglers is the type of worm I use. I get my worms from Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. I order them online every time if I need some new worms. But for the most part, once you get worms, if you take care of them, you don't need more. They will double every 3 months. So if you have 250 worms, you'll have 500 worms in 3 months, and you'll have almost 1,000 worms in 6 months. So they will grow to the size of your space, and you can do them and get a bunch of 35-gallon totes from Target and make your own worm bins and keep these things in your basement. You can go year round. If you live in a cold environment like I do, I live in Massachusetts, it freezes in the winter. I can't stir a compost pile. The wood chips that I would normally add for my browns are also frozen. The leaves are frozen. They're buried in snow or ice. And so for me, the alternative in the winter is a worm bin. Or doing some bokashi fermentation. So another great thing that you can do if you have an apartment or a small space, you can actually do composting with bokashi. It's a Japanese technique that uses fermentation to convert your food wastes over to a product that breaks down very quickly in soil. So you could do a 30-day ferment on your food waste in a 4 or 5 gallon bucket with a lid, and then take that and mix it with soil in a big tote, let that cook again for another 30 days, and you will have an incredibly rich soil that you can use on your plants. So there's lots of great techniques that we can use, even if you have a very small space. You don't have to have a big compost pile outside and turning it and worrying about temperatures and all those things. Worms are the best. But there's also great approaches with bokashi. I know people who also, if you have chickens, soldier flies is also a fantastic way to do composting. If you can deal with all the soldier fly larvae and all that, which the chickens love. So that's a bit about composting. I like to use compost teas, and that's one of the primary ways that I feed my plants. Is I like to brew up a weekly compost tea with an airlift brewer. So
Before we get into that, sorry to cut you off.
sure.
I would like to dig a little bit deeper into actually a worm bin
Okay.
because I'm actually starting it for the first time. I actually had a podcast episode with Queen of the Sun-Grown. Not sure if you know who she is. And she actually found out I was not doing composting. And just her, you could sense like a little bit of like frustration in her. Like her just passion came out of her.
Oh yeah.
Like once she said that, like, you aren't doing it? Why aren't you doing it? So like it really like it's kind of like a whip me into shape type thing, right?
Yeah.
So I went out, I started doing research. I'm about to go buy, I have a plan in place, about to go buy the bins right now. I'm going to buy I think they're 18-gallon bins.
Okay.
I think I'm going to buy 2 of them. I'm going to double stack it. I'll have
Yep.
worms in there. But just talking about the inputs, I think a lot of people, probably and myself included, I'm kind of getting caught up on what to input in there to begin. So my plan is just things I have around the house, right? So junk mail. I get a lot of junk mail that come in. So putting it through the shredder, adding that in there. Coffee grounds I was going to put in there. I have basil plant, and I have some house plants that are kind of, some of the leaves like die off and stuff.
Yep.
Put that in there. Lettuce, any salads that I don't eat, banana peels, hair. I guess you can put your own hair in there as well.
Sure, you could.
So you can even go that far. I'm trying to
Yep.
think of what other things I plan to add in there. That's kind of the main things that I'm going to be starting with. Oh, grass clippings from plants outside as well. If I'm like trimming bushes or whatever, I was going to throw that in there.
Those tend to be a little bit more for traditional compost piles, especially grass clippings.
So you wouldn't recommend them bringing them inside to your worm bin?
I don't know if I would do that. You could bring in some of those items from the outside, but you also got to remember your worms are only going to eat so much. So the first thing you need to gauge is how much food waste are you producing, and then how much do you need to augment on top of that. Okay. In general, you want to start with shredded paper and some fresh cocoa as the very beginning, the base, and you wet it. You want to squeeze it so that it pretty much is dry. It's not like squeezing out water, but maybe a little bit of a drip. You don't want it to be too dry, but you kind of mix that all together, that paper and that cocoa, and then you put your worms down in that and then give them a day or so to settle in. And then what you want to start using, most of those things that you said are great, with banana peels, apple cores, things like that. You want to try to chop them up because the smaller they are, the faster they're going to break down. Berries are awesome. They love berries. You'll have to kind of gauge. Sometimes some plants they don't like, especially the fresh leaves. They may not like them. They might be a little bit too bitter or a little bit too odorous. Some things they will actually move away from until they break down or dry out. So you might want to let the plant material dry. Another thing you need to keep an eye on is your moisture levels. So if you're putting in a lot of coffee grounds and fruit and things like that, you may want to add some extra paper or cardboard or things like that that will help balance off some of that. You don't want it to get too moist in there, right? And you want to make sure that there's some good drainage at the bottom of whatever the bin is that you put them in.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's all good information that I'm definitely going to be able to use. And like I mentioned, I was going to do the kind of like the double stack bin. So the bin that's stacked inside the other one is going to have the holes drilled through. Just like you can look up any YouTube video and see how they're drilling holes all around the bottom, and then up on the top as well. Like not the top lid. I guess a lot of people don't do the lid, but they'll do like around.
They'll put a couple air holes at the top just because you don't want it to be a closed environment. You want some airflow to be able to get in there. So that's why they put a couple of those holes at the top.
Yep.
And in general, the worms aren't going to escape because they don't like light. So they're going to stay away from the light. As soon as you open up the bin, the lid on the bin, they're going to dig down in because they don't want to be near the light. And so even if you have some holes on the side, they're not going to crawl out because they're going to try to avoid the light.
And then from my understanding, it should be, once they're stacked in there, you do it kind of like on a weekly basis to where on 1 week you're kind of putting things on one side of the bin, lightly covering it. And then the next week you're putting something on the other part of the bin and kind of moving things over. So that way there's some kind of rotation going on.
Yep.
And then
I do quarters.
Quarters, okay.
Kind of quadrants and move them around. And again, you need to gauge how fast the worms are consuming what you're putting in. If there's a lot of food left from the previous one, you just let them go. Don't feed them again because you want to give them time. You don't want a large buildup of composters and other types of smaller organisms and insects that you'll see. You will see some other small bugs crawling around in there, but those are composters. They're breaking those foods down. Worms don't actually eat the food in most cases. They're eating the molds and bacteria and things that grow on the foods as they break down, and their movements and shooting through things is what helps break down some of those materials. They also love avocado. That's a great thing to use. Melons, things like that. You want to stay away from meats and dairy. If you're going to be doing mail, be careful to get rid of those little plastic view windows. You don't want those in there. Don't be shredding your credit cards because then you're putting really sharp plastic into your worm bin, and the worms aren't going to like that very much, and you really don't want your plastics in there anyway. And I always feel a little, have mixed feelings about using mail in general, just because you don't know what they're printing it with. And everything that goes into your worm bin is going to go into the worms themselves and into the castings. And then whatever goes into those castings is going to go into your plants and then into you. So I try to, a lot of inks are actually soap based and they don't tend to be chemicals. Most printers and things like that, they actually print with it's kind of a soap. But things that are really, really lots of colors, I try to stay away from. Things that are very glossy, I'll stay away from, and just try to use things that are really just paper. things that are, electrical bills and things like that. Those are fine. But I would shy away from some of the really, glossy printed stuff that comes in the mail and some of those flyers and things like that. Cardboard is good, especially if you see recycling symbols on it or made from recycled cardboard, things like that. So those are all good inputs.
Okay. And then from my understanding, roughly 30 days, could be longer. There's a lot of variables with the temperature and so on and so forth, but roughly 30 days. And then you kind of have vermicompost, which you can use. You can take that and top dress your plants with it, for example. And then my question is underneath. So that second barrel is going to be collecting the waste, right? The verma tea, right? Vermicompost tea type thing, right?
It's a leachate.
Leachate, yeah, okay. How long does it take for that to develop? And then will it ever go like anaerobic? Like, is there a chance that do you need to be moving it around so it doesn't go anaerobic and bad pathogens?
Yeah, I would use it right away. It's not something you want to store. It's not something you want to keep. It's, I would check your bins once a week. At least, and then make sure that there isn't a lot of, that moisture, that water, and I would use it right away. That leachate, if you're going to use it, I would not store it or keep it around. You may not get any. I don't get any in my bin. It just depends on your moisture levels of your inputs.
Okay, and then that should be diluted. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to top dress with it, you are kind of diluting it, right? You're not, in most cases, if you pour something on the soil, it's kind of going to dilute naturally. But yeah, you could mix it in with some water or something as part of your feeding. Absolutely.
Cool. Nice. Well, I appreciate you taking some time to answer my questions there because I am about to start, which is exciting for me, something new,
Yeah, like I said, I like to use the vermicompost in a compost tea. So what I like to do is I use paint sprayer bags. Actually, paint strainer bags. So when you can get them at Home Depot, they're super cheap, and they're great. They make these like 5-gallon strainer bags, and you can put you can put vermicompost and leaf mold and all sorts of things for whatever you're using for your compost tea mixture. And they're great and they're easy to clean, so you can wash them and use them over and over again. But that's how I like to use my vermicompost instead of top dressing with it. Because I don't have enough. If I had a lot of vermicompost, then maybe I would probably top dress with it more. But to stretch it out, I think a great way to do that is to use, a cup or so in a compost tea brew and feed all of the plants off of that tea brew, as opposed to just, putting like a tablespoon or two on every one of the plants. But that's also an easy way to do it, is to just walk around, put a tablespoon or two right on top of the soil, and the water will naturally wash that stuff in and provide the benefit.
Gotcha. Now, talking about compost teas a little bit more, is there anything beyond the traditional things that we hear? I mean, just traditional, people use 5-gallon buckets. They fill about 4 gallons of water. They put about a cup of compost in there. Then, they add a sugar source, brew for around 24 hours, some people up to 48 hours. However, I've heard that there's issues going that long. Anything to kind of add to that process?
Sure. There's a couple of things actually that I can add to that. Number one, if you're going to use molasses as your sugar component, make sure to work that molasses into some warm water before you pour it into your compost tea mixture, okay? And the reason for that is that molasses are highly viscous, and they may, in some cases, end up coating some of the bubbles that are showing up as you're brewing, and that coating actually creates a small little anaerobic pocket. And so you end up brewing some anaerobic bacteria as well as your aerobic bacteria, and so you're not fully getting the benefits. So if you take that molasses and mix it with some water first, some warm water first to thin it down and kind of break up some of that viscosity, and then pour it into your compost tea, good to go. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you should be aerating the inside of your compost tea bag as well as the outside process that's brewing, right? So I run an air line into the bag itself So there's air bubbling inside the bag. So again, I'm not getting an anaerobic pocket if all that material kind of, meshes together and some ways blocks out some of the access to the oxygen in the water that's floating around it. It's going to create an anaerobic pocket as well. So you want to keep air inside those bags as well as the air that's happening from the rotation of the tea brew process. Third thing I'll mention is air stones can be problematic because they build up bacteria and not good bacteria over time. So if you clean them and or replace them, you probably aren't going to run into any issues, but I would highly recommend just going without the air stone on there, just running the tube of air directly onto the inside of the bag or into the bottoms of your thing, or use an airlift brewer like I use as a better approach as opposed to air stones, and you'll avoid any possible issues from those. So that's my recommendations. From Korean Natural Farming, compost tea or liquid IMO is usually brewed for 24 to 36 hours, and we tend to watch it by smell. So the smell will change over time of your brew. You'll start out with a sweet and earthy smell, of course, because you have the molasses and some of those other sweeteners in there. So you'll get this like earthy, natural, sweet smell to them. And over time, though, if you go too far, you'll actually start to get some moldy or rotting smells, and that means that you went too far. So that's kind of one of the things that we watch for a lot in Korean Natural Farming, are smells and tastes when we're creating our preparations. So yeah, usually we don't go beyond 36 hours because you do start to run into some of those conditions where you've started to burn out the good bacteria and you're left with nothing but the bacteria who actually are the cleaners, the bacteria that eat the other dead bacteria.
That's good information. I use air stones right now, and I might switch over. But one tip that I've heard and what I've been doing is in between brews, right? So after I'm done brewing, I'll take the air stones and I'll boil them, right? Boil them in water, so that'll kill off. The temperature gets so high, it'll kill off any bacteria on there at all. So that's what I personally do in order to prevent.
Some hydrogen peroxide could also be useful. But yeah, as long as you're cleaning them and maintaining them, if you use them again and again every day and they're just sitting there bubbling away day after day, you're going to start to attract molds and bacteria inside that stone that will do bad things.
Makes sense. So I know we're kind of going off course here from the list of questions I gave you, but I think it's really good that we're going because there's a lot of good information here. Is there anything else? Can you talk to us about some other things that you think that home gardeners can do as far as implementation practices for regenerative gardening?
Yeah. So again, I think using composting is an important practice that you should consider. One of the great resources that most home gardeners have access to actually is leaf mold. Leaf mold is an incredible input, and basically leaf mold is the stuff you find underneath your pile of leaves that's not quite soil but almost soil. Well, that's pure humus. And it's a beautiful, beautiful organic material. And you can actually take that and put that in mix that in with your soils to kind of give them a inoculation, actually, of natural organisms and life that will help those plants get started if you're trying to follow into a living and organic type of an approach. And I think one of the things that we should probably cover is just real briefly soils, because there's a lot of different terms for soils, right? You have soilless mediums, you have soil. Soil itself is sand, silt, and clay, humic material, and biology, right? So you can't have actual soil if you don't have the biological compound, the biology in there too. That's what turns dirt into soil, is the life, the humic materials and the life, the biology. You also hear a lot of these terms, living soil and super soil. right? That's a common terms of phrase that are used out there often. Super soil is really a enriched soil. Okay, super soil is actually a specific recipe created by a specific person that had a specific set of materials and inputs in it
Shout out
that
to
he
Subcool.
coined. That's right. That he coined super soil. But the reality is it's an enhanced medium. It's not a true soil. Some people will refer to it as a soilless medium because you're taking soil and then you're mixing in a lot of other compounds and substrates, peats, perlites, crab meal, lobster compost, different types of things. And when you do that, you're kind of getting away from real true soil, and you're creating what I like to refer to as enhanced or enriched soil. And that tends to actually be my base. So I actually use Coast of Maine Stonington Blend is my primary base. Has a tremendous amount of really good organic compounds. It's made here in New England where I live. Coast of Maine, I'm in Massachusetts, so it's a product that's produced here. It has a lot of peat in it. It has lobster compost. It has some kelp, some kelp meal, and some other great things. So it's an enriched medium. Living soil, on the other hand, is actually true natural soil that is alive, and you're relying on the biology, worms, arthropods, ciliates, all the bacterial and fungal life that you're promoting to create the nutrients that the plant needs to survive, right? And to do true living soil as a home gardener, as a home grower, you need at least a 35-gallon pot, which can be difficult for people indoors, especially. You need something on wheels. A lot of people have been moving into no-till beds, living soil beds. And I mentioned no-tilling earlier on in the podcast, right? And so this is a fantastic approach for anybody who's looking to go completely regenerative, completely closed loop, is using living soil beds as opposed to pots. Having a 2x2 living soil bed is actually is a 2x2 pot is about 35, 40 gallons of soil. A 3x3 is about 75 gallons of soil. A 4-foot by 4-foot bed is actually about 100 gallons of soil. So imagine trying to lift 100 gallons of soil. You can't do it. You actually have to shovel the soil out of those beds if you don't have them on wheels. I've seen people fill their tent with one big 4x4 living soil bed, and it's a beautiful approach. You're using cover crops. You're utilizing worms. You're utilizing natural you're using companion plants, which is also great. And you're you're building basically a natural environment that's alive and as close to a biodynamic approach as possible, as close to a natural approach as possible. You're trying to create the outdoors inside. You're allowing the plant to naturally manage the biology in the soil to get what it needs. And it's a fantastic approach. I have a friend, Blue, who uses Avocado Tech to help keep his living soil beds going. And he's gone 16, 17 cycles in the same beds. All he does is chop the plant. He leaves all the roots and everything in. He lets leaves and things fall to the ground. He's got cover crops in there that he chops and drops and smashes down. But he also uses this great thing called Avocado Tech.
Yeah, I'm actually having him on the podcast soon to talk all about Avocado Tech. Yeah,
he's a fantastic guy and a great friend of mine. We actually went to a regenerative conference together, which is where I met him. And his Avocado Tech is fantastic. And so he makes kind of a guacamole with some crab meal and some other inputs, azomite and some good natural inputs makes this guacamole and stuffs it back in the avocado skin and puts it face down on the soil. And what happens is the worms actually come up out of the soil bed and run through the avocado and move and actually bring all that nutrient goodness back down into the soil naturally for him. He uses 3 avocados an entire cycle. That's his whole deal.
That's incredible.
And other than that, he just has water dripping with the Blue Mat system, which is an incredible water saving system. I love Blue Mat. I myself don't run. I try to use as little water as possible. So I keep my plants wet, but I don't water to runoff, which a lot of people do. I'm just trying to use just as much water as I need to keep the plants wet, not trying to soak them down. But I'm trying to make sure that obviously they don't develop dry spots, but just trying to keep them wet. Blue mats are a great system that is a passive system even. You don't really even need any power for them. You can use gravity and basically fill a bucket of water and you use these, they have these carrots, these electrostatic carrots that basically sit in the soil and detect soil moisture. And based on the level of moisture, they let water drip. And so you get these little drips of water all day long. And that's actually one of the most efficient watering systems around because you're allowing the plants actually to dictate the moisture level in the soil. And they just get as much as they need. If they're really thirsty, you're going to use up some more water, but you're only using what the plant needs. You're not pouring a ton on and having runoff and then throwing that out. You're not, trying to recycle. You don't need to. It's all keeping maintained. And the only thing that, it only drips as needed. They're really, really great systems. I really enjoy using the Blue Mat. I'm not using them. I don't have them plugged in right now, but I'm probably going to be going back to them too. And they tend to develop some amazing root balls as well. Really, really impressive root structures when you use that type of an approach.
I've been using Blue Mats, and you see pictures online. You can see like the roots coming up, going towards the dripper, where it's actually dripping. And I believe it can kind of clog your lines too, right? If you're not keeping an eye on it, the root will go all the way up into there and clog it. So you got to be careful there. But yeah, once you get that saturation rate down as far as what you want in that container, stick the carrot in there. You got it hooked up to your res, just all gravity fed.
Yep.
If you're using organics, you're just top dressing the medium, staying that moisture level that it needs to be for those microbes to break down those amendments. And it's so much hands off compared to a synthetic bottled nutrient line where you're mixing nutrients every week, sometimes twice a week in order to, hand water your plant. Or, you can always do the synthetic nutrients in the Blue Mat as well. But just in general, you
have to be careful.
Yeah.
Because you'll clog you can clog those lines if you're not careful. You'd have to flush them often. So you definitely have to be careful, especially with some of the organic nutrients.
Yep.
Some of those tend to be thick. Like I used to use Medi 1 from Green Planet, and that stuff is like just sludge. The main base, but it's an organic medical base. It's a great product, really beautiful, but I definitely wouldn't have fed that through the Blue Mats.
Right. So one more thing let's talk about before we wrap things up. I kind of want to get into cover crops a little bit. So I've been using cover crops. I just use the white Dutch clover right now. I know it's well known for nitrogen fixation, right? It's going to take nitrogen in the air, convert it to a form that's usable by the plant. The plant will be able to uptake it. Now, can you talk to us just about your knowledge about cover crops? What other cover crops can we be using in an indoor environment, home growers, the benefits of cover crops?
Yeah, I there's a lot of mixes out there already on the market, and most of them have a combination of different types of clovers, white clovers, red clovers, which actually have different benefits, both the red and the white clovers, vetch, sweet peas, different types of grasses, and having a mix of different types of cover crops is actually a benefit. I think Ray Archuleta is up to like 16 or 17 different crops in his mix that he's been testing and that he's using out in his fields for cattle and things like that. It depends on, what you're trying to accomplish. I know there's also been some information out recently about clover, and start avoiding clover in some cases because mites love clover.
Oh, interesting.
So, although you might not necessarily have mites on your plants, they might be in your clover. So it could be a trap plant. It might be good for a trap plant to keep the mites off of your plant. It might encourage them to go after the clover because they love clover. And I know there's a few folks out there, I think Tad Hussey, possibly Kiss Organics, or one of the other gentlemen. He actually stopped using clovers in his mixes because of the mite problems that can develop, especially if you're outdoors, using clover in your mixes. So I love vetch. I love sweet peas. Beans are also great if you plant beans. Rosemary, thyme. Even you can throw some of your companion plants in there as well. Calendula is a great plant to put in there. Marigolds. You can put those in there as well. They have good IPM benefits. They help keep pests away. Lavender, thyme, rosemary, things like that. And if you're doing a living soil bed, you may want to consider some of the perennial forms of that, because there's like climbing forms of rosemary and thyme that you could grow for years and years and kind of grow it throughout your bed or in your environment, and maybe bonsai it even if you want. But having a good variety of plants in your mix is really important. Blue, I think he even has squash growing, and some other vegetables and things in his living soil beds as well. But yeah, no, I like the vetches and grasses, and I still use some clover in my mix as well because of that nitrogen fixation. I think some of the thing that people should also remember, though, is that to get the full benefits out of cover crops, you need to chop and drop.
Explain that, because I don't think people know what exactly it is.
Right. So in general, right, you should never have naked soil. Keep your soil covered. I like to use rice hulls and a mix of... I do a mix with some wood shavings, some bokashi, and then a bunch of rice hulls, and I put about an inch and a half deep on the top of my soil. Keep your soil covered at all times, indoors or outdoors. Exposed soil outdoor is actually one of the things that is causing climate change and CO2 release. Again, as they till the fields, they turn the soil over and expose the carbon in the soil to the oxygen, which creates CO2, carbon, oxygen, CO2, and it rises. And they've actually photographed, NASA has maps that show the increases in CO2 release from space, the increases in CO2 release at the times when they're tilling all the fields. You can actually see this from space. So it's definitely something that you want to try to avoid. But so you want to use those mulches. Those green mulches or cover crops are also beneficial. The cover crops themselves will, in some cases, release beneficial things into the soil. Nitrogen fixing, like you were saying, clover releases nitrogen. Actually, that's a great thing for your lawn. Don't get rid of the clover in your lawn. Add the clover back in, because if you add the clover back in, you don't need Scott's fertilizer on your lawn, because the clover will help your grass. You don't need it. Get all the nitrogen you need from the worms in the clover. So you want to then what's called chop and drop. So you chop those cover crops. You chop them down. You cut them. Snip, 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 like mowing. You don't cut them all the way to the ground or kill them. The idea is you want to cut them so that you're leaving some of the plant to grow back, like you're mowing the lawn almost. And then you leave that material in the pot, in the soil, to become a natural mulch. When plants grow, they are carbon capture machines. Everything that a plant produces comes with a carbon exchange. Okay, everything, whether it's their smell, their body, their leaves, their stems, their fruits, all of it has to do with a carbon exchange, and are created as, they have carbon. They're part of carbon. They have carbon. Everything has carbon in it. And so plants are, as they grow, they are capturing carbon and other minerals and nutrients. And if you drop them directly into the soil and allow them to go back into the ground, you're re-nutrifying, you're putting those minerals, that carbon and those vitamins and nutrients back into the soil where they can be recaptured by the biology in the plants. Okay, so cover crops themselves are beneficial because they help retain moisture in the soil. They help keep your soil covered, and in some cases, as we were saying, they'll help add nutrients back into the soil. Cutting them down and dropping them in also helps remineralize the soil. If you take that stuff out, what's happening is those plants are leaching minerals and nutrients out of the soil. And then if you chop them and take them away, you basically lost all those minerals and nutrients from your soil. If you drop them back in, you're putting them back in the ground where they came from. So that's kind of the idea. And then ideally, to really take advantage of chop and drop, you need worms. You need biology in the soil that's going to break down those compounds back into minerals and nutrients that the plant can absorb.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Yeah, I've been practicing chop and drop for a couple grows now. And yeah, it's something I'm definitely going to continue to do because it makes sense. It makes sense. And
yep.
You're saving on nutrients in a sense, right? I mean, if you're putting it back into the system that it was in, it's just breaking down, and then the plant is uptaking it eventually. And I think a perfect example of chop and drop, which a lot of people don't really think of, is when you're mowing your lawn, right? You should keep those lawn clippings there, as ugly as they may be sometimes, right? Keep them there because those are going to break down, and that'll rejuvenate your lawn. Like you mentioned, you get to spend less money on Scott's fertilizer if you do it that way. So,
don't rake your leaves, mulch them in.
Mulch them in, yeah. Good point.
Absolutely, because that's all fantastic beneficial nutrients back into the soil. When you haul those things away, you're robbing your environment of those great natural materials. I mean, you look at the rainforest, right? The rainforest, nobody cleans and picks those leaves up, right? The plants drop, they fall, they die, animals swing through, break stuff, eat stuff. And they're these extremely healthy environments. Why? Because everything is retained within that environment. Nothing gets taken out of that environment and taken away.
Well said. Well, we covered quite a bit in this podcast. I mean, this hour flew by. Definitely a lot of great information here. I definitely think there's some information here that home gardeners will be able to grasp onto. You explained it in a very beginner-friendly manner. Hopefully, some of you guys will be able to implement this into your gardens. I'm doing composting now. I'm doing chop and drop. We covered a whole bunch of other things. But really, in the grand scheme of things, we didn't cover a lot at all when it comes to regenerative gardening. There's so much more to it. And maybe in the future, we just scratched the surface. So maybe sometime in the future, we can have you on for a part 2 and kind of get deeper into things, because I definitely think there's a lot of other things that we could have covered. So yeah, I appreciate your time here.
I encourage people to look for opportunities to use the things they have around them in some way, shape, or form, whether it's your food waste, whether it's your leaves, grass clippings, plants. All of the stuff around you are natural, beneficial items that can be incorporated into your garden in some way, shape, or form. Keep your soils covered. Don't have naked soil, and look for opportunities to keep the plants in the ground, keep the ground intact when you harvest as well, right? So chop the plant at the stalk, leave the roots in there, let that biology, let that all those natural, wonderful things that are going on in that soil continue. Don't rip it out, plant right next to it, keep moving around. If you're in small pots, obviously you're going to be having to redo those pots. You can't really do living soil in a 5-gallon pot, as I was saying earlier. So if you're in pots, you can actually recycle your soil even. So when you're done with your cycle of that plant, take the roots and rinse the soil off of it. You can soak those roots in water, and that will pull sugars and exudates out of them, and you can use them also to feed your plants and water your plants with. You can save that soil and actually add compost and natural things back into it and let it cook over the winter. And in the spring, you can utilize it. You can do it in bins in your basement as well. You could take and mix in worm castings. So take your worm castings, mix it in with some of that used soil, and maybe do a little Avocado Tech on top. And you won't, after a while, if you have a good amount of soil and you have a good process going, you don't actually have to go buy soil either. You can build up to the point where you have a good pile of soil that you recycle, and you can remineralize so that you can use it over and over again. That's another place where you can look to preserve and save some money, and try to do some more regenerative practices, and really looking to again reduce waste. I think that's the best thing to do. Look for opportunities to use the things around you. If you're in the middle of Kansas, you don't need oyster shells.
Well said. Well, wrapping things up, how can the listeners find you? And what do you have upcoming in the future?
So I can be found every day on Instagram, where I post pictures of my garden every morning, at Jotaherb, Jotaherb on Instagram. I can also be found extremely frequently on Clubhouse. So for those that are unaware, Clubhouse is an app that's available on both iOS and Android. It's free to join. You don't need to be invited anymore. And it's a fantastic audio only conversation app. And so I'm on there having conversations with people about growing and agriculture. But also I host a show every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, which is also simulcast on YouTube.
Awesome. Well, I will provide a link to his Instagram down in the description section below. If you like this video, click that thumbs up button. Comment, drop a comment below. Let us know what you think of this video. Let us know what regenerative practices you do in your garden. We'd love to hear. Like you said, we just scratched the surface on this one. There's a lot more to talk about. So let us know what you do and what you recommend down in the comment section below. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. I release these podcast episodes every single weekend, either Saturdays or sometimes Sundays, depending on how the weekend goes, depending on if Susan from YouTube approves the video and allows me to post it on time or not. Also, if you are on Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating and review. I'm coming up to 200 ratings and reviews. That's what we're trying to get to next. There has actually been a lot of people leaving ratings and reviews lately. So if you're on Apple Podcasts, please leave that rating and review. And yeah, thank you so much one more time for coming on to this podcast. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me on. Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation, and absolutely happy to have another one again. So thanks, everybody, and happy growing.
Awesome. Take care. Peace.